Welcome to my Otaku Life blog. It's a slice of life blog where I talk about what I have been up to lately. I've been reading a poem called The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. I don't know if I liked it that much, but then again, I don't like poems in general. Anyway, I'm not sure I enjoy poems that moan about modern life and how boring and meaningless it is. My usual reaction is, okay, so what now? What are you going to do about it? Writing a poem about it doesn't seem to make anything better. Many of the videos I watched about the poem made it seem boring and depressing. Why aren't there any poets who aren't state-appointed propagandists, who can write something positive about the achievements of the modern world? I guess people just want to hear their complaints reflected back to them. I'm just sick of it. I'm worried that all this negativity has turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy for Europe. My music playlist is filled with nationalist songs from all over the world, including the Soviet Union. Not because I like any of these countries, but because they are not defeatist. I also read the first book of Paradise Lost, which so far seems to be about the defeat of the devil by God. It seemed like all the good lines were given to Satan, so I guess we are supposed to identify with him. I looked into the background a bit, and John Milton was an anti-monarchist who collaborated with Cromwell's Puritan Republican dictatorship. In Paradise Lost, God is referred to as a monarch by the devil, and at least in the first book, we only really see the devil's perspective. It's the first perspective that we see really. Given that Milton himself fought against a monarchy, it sounds like he associated his ill-fated opposition to the British king with Satan's rebellion against the King of Kings. I've also heard that Paradise Lost might be a kind of Gnostic text, or at least popular among Freemasons and other secret societies. I heard that from the Predictive History channel. I can't remember the exact details, but the idea was that God lied to Adam and Eve, telling them that they would die if they ate the fruit, but they didn't really die immediately. In other words, the Gnostic implication is that both the devil and humans were punished by God because God was afraid that humans or the devil would reach his level. In other words, he didn't want competition. I don't think Milton even claimed to have had a revelation, so I'm not sure if I should take any of this seriously. It just seems like fan fiction about what the devil might have taught. And if Milton didn't claim that this is what the devil really taught, then what is the point of all of this? I don't think the pagans will like this book either. Book 1 of Paradise Lost also attempts to integrate native European deities into Christianity by claiming that all the European gods were fallen angels. There's always some plausible deniability about whether Milton is taking the devil's side, because Milton basically says that the devil is coping, but there's no doubt that the devil seems heroic and noble because he's going against destiny and fate. Another thing, a lot of the time the spelling used is weird. But if you listen to an audiobook, there's a good one on LibriVox. I'll link it in the description. It's just much easier to understand what's been said than when you read the text. Then again, you might not have this difficulty. Satan gets all the best lines, like better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. But it's clear that he's coping. The reason I say this is because the demons consider if the fact that they are still alive and kicking is all according to God's plan. But then they go right back to assuming that they have some kind of freedom. Through some convoluted logic which makes no sense but is rhetorically effective, basically about how it would be cowardly to ask for forgiveness, they seem to want to counterattack. It's like the devil has to deceive himself with his corpse first, to deceive his underlings, and then to deceive Eve later on. Pandemonium, the capital of hell, sounds a lot like a generic Demon King's castle city in JRPGs or isekai anime, even more than Tolkien. But I like the little detail that the demons can downsize themselves to the size of dwarves to fit inside the hole where they are going to have a meeting. I was less impressed with the idea that demons can change their sets. It seems like a low-hanging fruit to go there. I also read the first chapter of a textbook, An Introduction to Literature, Criticism and Theory by Andrew Bennett et al. about beginnings in literary works. The conclusion was that you can't really decide what the beginning of a text is because of intertextuality. Sometimes there are things like pretexts, by which they don't mean excuses, they mean things like introduction or the title, things that you see before the main text. The main idea was that every text is based on other texts, so your initial reaction isn't necessarily the most important or organic. When you read other texts that may be referenced back and then come back to the text you were reading originally, your interpretation changes. Also, when you reread a text, knowing what happens later can affect how you feel about the text as a whole and about earlier events. I do feel, however, that this is a very critic-centric interpretation which puts all of the agency in the critic. The text doesn't even matter until it is read, and I basically think that it is self-serving, but I don't have a way of disproving or proving that it is wrong. But I don't think it would necessarily be useful for a creator to look at it from this perspective, because I think it encourages a lack of originality. Because if what you are doing while writing is just referencing other texts, then why should you try to make anything new? Then again, I've seen a lot of bad stuff which comes out of artists trying to just surprise the audience. So it all depends on how effectively it is what you do, whether it is not whether it is something new or old. I've also been watching an anime called Blade Dance of the Elementalists. It's a light novel adaptation. Honestly, I'm enjoying it more than anything popular or considered to be good these days. I watched Gigak's video about last year, and while everything looked good, it seemed kind of soulless, just people showing off their animation skills. The most interesting recent anime he talked about was probably Orb on the movements of the Earth, which is about heliocentrism. But the problem is, I now know that the whole Galileo affair wasn't as black and white as it's often presented. Knowing the historical context isn't exactly accurately portrayed in the show puts me off from watching it. And anyway, I'm finding this old light novel adaptation more enjoyable than anything airing right now. Maybe I'm just tired of good things. I also had a stupid debate, well, not a debate, but I'm part of an anime club, and someone asked if I liked Attack on Titan. I said I liked the first 3 seasons. It was funny how people reacted just because I didn't say I liked the whole thing. Maybe I'm just addicted to having a minority opinion or being some kind of anime hipster. I need to think more about why I like some of these old light novel adaptations. In Gigak's video, he showed a bunch of screenshots of similar looking protagonists and made the old overused joke about how if you haven't watched the different shows, the main characters all look alike. I could identify some of them from different shows, and I'm sure he could too. His point was that if you hadn't watched the shows, you wouldn't know that they were different characters. But first of all, I think they were not really that identical. You could tell them apart. The art styles were different. Second, why does the opinion of someone who hasn't watched the show even matter? I guess what I like about these light novel adaptations is that they feel very pure. I don't know if I can describe it. The novel I published on my website got about 600 to 700 views. Not many comments, and I got a 1-star review. Which is fine. It's not that good of a story. I really want to get back into novel writing, but right now I'm stuck in editing hell. It's a pain. I almost wish I could pay someone to edit it, but I can't afford that. On a friend's suggestion, I'll probably try to upload an audiobook version of the novel I'm working on. It's not very good, and it's unnecessarily political, but I just can't keep politics out of my mind. It's approaching Stockholm Syndrome. Maybe a friend of mine can help with the audiobook for the first few chapters. After that, I could continue myself or pay him to do the rest, which would have been possible if my car hadn't broken down. I had to buy a new one, annoyingly. My old car is probably headed for the scrapyard tomorrow because the engine is broken. Whatever you do, don't buy Peugeot. I learned my lesson and bought a Japanese car this time. It's a small one, a red 2020 Toyota Agio. It's fine, I like small cars. Maybe I'll add a picture if I can blur the license plate. I think I did well in my last video by adding Toram Online footage. I'm thinking of using these videos as an excuse to play more Toram Online. I've also been watching a lot of Japanese YouTubers as part of my immersion into Japanese. Last week I found out about AJAT, all Japanese all the time, by a guy named Katsumoto. I'm trying to do AJAT, emphasis on trying. So I've been listening to Japanese people play Toram online while I do other things. I also went to a screening of Gachiakuta, where we watched the first 8 episodes. I didn't really like it, but that's not really a surprise. It felt like it was just going to be a series of battles. I don't like the way the powers work in a lot of shonen manga, including this one. Basically, everyone has a unique power, which diminishes the plausibility of the story for me. It makes it hard for me to take the setting seriously. I feel like if people had superpowers, it would make more sense if everyone had the same kind. Having different powers only makes sense because it's more interesting for a story, not for a plausible world. It undermines it for me, though I get that it's hard to have everyone with the same power in a story. I also didn't like how transparent they were about the protagonist being special. It's not that it makes it harder to self-insert, but if the protagonist is going to be overpowered, just start the story with them being overpowered. Don't pretend that they're weak. It feels like a waste of time. I've seen so many stories where the protagonist suddenly finds out that they're strong, they're the chosen one. I just want them to get on with it. So I ended up complaining about the anime here anyway. Maybe I like the other anime which I talked about, the light novel, because it's unashamedly trying to appeal to otaku, something which people don't like, but I like it. At the start of Gachiakuta, the protagonist is betrayed by everyone, including his love interest, and thrown into a pit. No, I'll grant that there's a lot of otaku pandering stories which are about revenge as well. There are some which I do like, but so I guess I'm a hypocrite, whatever. So yeah, the protagonist gets thrown into a pit, and then it's a completely different setting. I didn't like the setting change and twist. It reminded me of the setting change in Attack on Titan. The Gachiakuta also reminded me of Battle Angel Alita, except the setting isn't as dark. People have tinted hair and tattoos, and there's graffiti, but I'm sure if you have seen both, you will see the similarities. But I didn't like the setting change, even though I think I did something similar in my own novel, where the protagonist is thrown from one setting to another until the story actually starts. Maybe I should cut that out, but I can't be bothered. I just want to keep adding to the story. Now, the setting change reminded me of Attack on Titan, which changed what the story was about, and I wasn't interested in the fake politics or the whole debate about who the Marlians are supposed to represent. So that's the end of my anime rant. On Europe, the rest of this video is going to be talking about Europe. I've lived in Europe for about 20 years now, and I guess I have some thoughts about that. I haven't lived here continuously. There was a period of about 8 years when I lived in another country, Sri Lanka to be precise. I faced quite a lot of culture shock when I first landed there, and to a certain extent I still feel it for a few weeks when I go back there from time to time. But this isn't about my feelings towards Sri Lanka. I've only lived in 2 European countries really, Italy and the UK. Well, if you consider Scotland and England to be different countries, you could say I've been in 3 different ones. But even in Italy, I lived in Tuscany, which is in the north. So I would say that these are just my thoughts about Northern Europe for the most part. Initially, my feelings towards this continent were that it is a very rational and fair place where people are not bound by traditional superstitions. What prompted me to make this post is the current news regarding Greenland. Whatever you think about it, and not just Greenland but also Ukraine, it just makes Europe look weak, dependent, and reminded me of a bunch of little Italian city-states being bullied by larger powers in the Middle Ages and beyond. The only thing European leaders could do in response was talk tough in front of the press. I'm not sure what should happen, which is why I wanted to reconsider all the feelings I've had towards Europe over the years, to understand this century of humiliation, which the 21st century is turning out to be unless Europe changes its course. At first I thought the people of this continent were fundamentally rational. My tastes in architecture reflected that hopeful attitude. They leaned towards modern commercial architecture because I had a hopeful vision of the rest of the world emulating this continent as an example. The United States wasn't even really in my mind. I thought it was just a cultural extension, tendril of Europe and its ideal, just a copy of Europe. I believed in social welfare and its potential to create opportunities for people to get ahead. I didn't make a distinction between the state and the private sector. It seemed normal that people would open businesses and the state instead would create large infrastructure projects like motorways. I used to really like the idea of motorways and basically anything that was modern. I associated modernity, both cultural and technological, with Europe, and it seemed obvious that the rest of the world would and should follow in Europe's footsteps. Of course, I used to believe in myths like the Dark Ages, which have since been debunked. Now, I wonder if such myths are necessary, and if my quest for the truth has destroyed any hope, along with those narratives of progress. At least if not in the Dark Ages, maybe we should be able to believe in a possible renaissance or risorgimento. Perhaps those are also an illusion. Maybe you can't achieve progress through the mere illusion of it. One of the most pathetic and annoying sights is to listen to a nationalist boasting about the achievements of his failed society. I guess I also had an almost colonial mindset. I wouldn't have been against European states going around the world building large infrastructure projects. But funnily enough, it's China doing that now, while Europeans can't even manage to build such infrastructure projects in their own continent at a reasonable pace. Just look at HS2 in the UK. My vision of Europe has moved from one of progress to one of stagnation. I also used to associate Europe with free speech, political freedom, and the free exchange of ideas. But now it seems those things were never really possible. I do not want to suspect that they were the illusion of an ideal foisted on Europe by the Americans for their own benefit and at Europe's expense. But some ideas are always going to be unacceptable, namely those which undermine the current ruling class, whatever it is. I also didn't really see any potential issues with feminism. It made me uneasy because it looked like a special interest group pushing society into factionalism. But it seemed to me that even if there were issues, reasonable discussion and compromise were possible. Reasonableness or rationality is another thing I associated with Europe. I guess another association was equality and fairness, social equality and equality of opportunity. I didn't really see the social issues brewing under the surface. When it comes to those issues, it seems like the rest of the world is now following Europe's lead. I almost believe that Europe had figured it all out. I was not completely ignorant because of the internet of the issues tearing apart Europe, but I thought it was just a temporary crisis of confidence. My opinion on all these things hasn't been completely overturned. There is a kind of order in Europe you can't find elsewhere, but it's a stultifying order. It feels like Europe has been torn apart by outside forces, yet I don't think those powers have anything to offer to Europe either. Only false visions of what Europe used to be or could be. Even those who want to defend Europe, not for the sake of some foreign power, don't have any ideas except to turn Europe into a kind of continent-sized open-air museum. Or worse yet, they literally escape into mythology to lick at each other's wounds by talking about Homer and Arthurian legends. I also failed to see the class divisions in Europe when looking at it from the outside. It seemed like Europeans had sorted out those kinds of issues. I'm talking about certain section of the population being removed from civilized society, basically stuck in a subhuman lifestyle with no way forward, with no growth. It wasn't something I noticed before. Perhaps I was being unreasonable by projecting these unrealistic expectations onto Europe. But there are some good things. When people get into positions of power, maybe this is more true in the UK than in Italy, it doesn't go to their heads as much. In other places I've seen, when people get a little bit of power, they treat others like dirt under their shoes. There's less of that here in Europe. But on the other hand, sometimes when you're talking to someone who works for a company or the government, it doesn't feel like you're speaking to a human being because they have to follow procedure. If you say something outside their script, they don't know how to answer because if they did something not part of their organizational policy, they would be in trouble. Basically, the rules are absolute, but they are only there to avoid responsibility, to save their own skin, not out of a sense of fairness. At the same time, you see people in the lower class who don't live by these procedures at all, but somehow survive on handouts. And there they are as if to serve as a kind of example to scare you about what will happen to you if you stop working for a visibly stagnant society. I don't know what the solution is. You need rules. You can't have a society where anything goes. At the same time, it's the little things that leave you without a choice. Even when it comes to freedom in Europe, it's a kind of limited freedom in practice, a freedom that exists only for a rhetorical purpose. Mind you, this isn't what Europe actually is. I have a very limited frame of reference, and this is purely based on my subjective experience. What I initially associated with Europe, having been born here, was freedom, modernity, prosperity, reason or rationality, and maybe basic equality in rights and duty. I believed this was a mostly reasonable place, a continent of citizens rather than subjects, underpinned by reason, and that the rest of the world would follow in Europe's footsteps. I did not perceive a lot of the issues I see now. Maybe what I thought Europe was never really existed. But I'm kind of wondering if it would be better if people could believe in these myths. Because believing might be the first step to making them real, at least somewhat real. But I feel Europe is lost without any notion of progress, and it's just being pushed around by other powers like Russia, China, and the United States. There's a disconnect between the vision of Europe that the ruling intellectual class has and that which its people have. The only way to mend those ties would have to be something visible and grand in scale, something revolutionary. Maybe huge infrastructure mega projects could rejuvenate this aging continent. Even to create the illusion of progress, things need to at least move in that direction. You need some kind of signs of progress. It feels a bit idiotic to be making grandiose suggestions like this while walking in a park. Well, actually, it's a skateboard in place. Just as I used to have faith in Europe, Europeans need to have faith in Europe again. The problem is that too many people have been left behind on too many levels, which is why I don't think anyone can take the idea of progress seriously, of the future seriously. I'm reminded of that anime, Eden of the East, but in the end they didn't really come up with a good solution either, except for escaping into subculture. Thinking back about Paradise Lost, I wonder if it was Milton's way of coping with a failed political project he believed in by escaping into mythology, into the over-analysis of mythology. I'm kind of disappointed by a lot of European literature that I've read, honestly. I don't think that the answer is to be found there. I don't think that the answer to what Europe is or should be can be found in mythology. I find people who analyze mythology for morals and for what a civilization should be kind of questionable. That's probably my problem with Nietzsche as well, another European thinker. For all his talk about the Übermensch creating his own values, it's just a recycling of pagan values, just like Milton tries to turn those pagan deities into Christian demons. Maybe the reason I have become disillusioned with Europe isn't just the reality of it, but also that I'm disappointed by the ideas I've tried to read. It just seems like a kind of endless references to the past and nostalgia. I don't think the answer is to be found there. The answer is, I don't know where it is.